The fifth screencast in this series of introductory screencasts for King Lear is a brief look at metre and the poetry of the play. I say it's brief, and I hope it will be. I'm assuming that most students, by the time they've reached year 13, are familiar with terms such as iambic pentameter. I'm assuming that most students, by the time they've reached year 13, have read other Shakespeare plays, for example, and have engaged with poetry to a level that means I don't need to go all the way back to the absolute basics, and that I can comfortably use some of the technical language associated with poetry. So it's worth, having said what I've just said, just clarifying. The iambic pentameter, the basic rhythmic unit of a Shakespearean line, I've annotated it there in the top of this screen as da-dum, 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 da-dum. The X's being the unstresses, the dashes or the strikes being the stressed syllables. 5 match pairs of unstressed and stressed syllables, 10 syllables to a line, generally thought to represent the natural rhythm of speech, and I think if you start to think about this, you'll find that this is the case. Those of you that are interested in looking further should hunt down an absolutely wonderful little book by Stephen Fry, of QI fame, amongst other things, called The Ode Less Travelled, in which he goes through essentially every form of poetry in the English language, talking about how it fits together and encouraging you to practice writing it. And his games for practicing iambic pentameters are great, and actually, as much as anything else, are a much better way of passing the time than sitting doing crosswords, sudokus, or playing games on a handheld computer. Anyway, if we assume that, broadly speaking, Shakespeare's verse, blank verse, tends not to rhyme, is written in iambic pentameter, then we have to also assume that the interest is created by variations to that pattern. That might be by substituting usually the first or last foot of an iamb, a da-dum, with a trochee, a dum-de. And certainly for my students listening to this who have been working on Paradise Lost for much of the first half of the autumn term, this will be something that you're very, very familiar with, the way that we can stress an idea, a name, a character, a feeling, by just altering the stress pattern within the iambic pentameter. But the thing I want to talk about today actually is the way that gaps in the metre can be used, and the way that Shakespeare creates interest either by extending lines, and I referred to 1 or 2 line extensions on earlier screencasts, or reducing them. And I've put an example here. This is in the argument in Act 1, Scene 1. As I say, these are really introductory talks. I'm trying to keep a lot of my comment about the early part of the play. If you remember in Act 1, Scene 1, Lear, having been offended by Cordelia's refusal to inflate her love for him, is banishing her. And at the end of a speech here, "As thou my sometime daughter," Kent interrupts him. "Good my liege." And if we count the syllables here, "as thou my sometime daughter, good my liege," we can begin to see, as I'll explain on the next slide, that that's actually one line of iambic pentameter. But something different happens in the pair of lines below. To look at it in slightly more detail, "As thou my sometime daughter, good my liege," we can see, because Kent takes on the closing feat of that iambic pentameter, that he is interrupting Lear. There is an urgency about it. Now, to interrupt the king in full flow is probably about as dangerous an act as one could conceive of doing. And the next lines show this clearly, because the next line, "Peace, Kent!" has as its conclusion a silent 8 syllables. The 4 feet that simply do not appear until he says, "Come not between the dragon and his wrath." A straightforward, clean and clear iambic pentameter. That pause is written into the meter of the verse. If one reads the verse correctly, one has to make that pause. And then think about it. What happens in that gap? In a crowded chamber, Kent has interrupted the king and he has been silenced by, I would argue, not an iamb, but by a spondy, the two heavy, stressed syllables. I think the comma allows for that. Peace, Kent! Lear establishes his authority. In that break, what happens on stage? The crowd gasp. Cordelia makes a move towards him to urge his silence. Lear gathers himself, maybe stands from his throne. The time for all this has been given by the gap in the meter. On the next slide here, there's another one, and I'd like you to read this yourselves and work this out for yourselves. Where are the gaps and what purpose do they fulfill? And pause at this point whilst you do so. Now that you think you've sorted that and you're listening again, let's just quickly look. At the end of sort of the Cordelia bargaining scene in 1-1, Lear has dismissed Cordelia into France's care. "Thou hast her, France, let her be thine, for we have no such daughter, nor shall ever see that face of hers again. Therefore be gone, without our grace, our love, our benison." Straightforward iambic lines. Suddenly, "Come, noble Burgundy," a shortened line. "Come, noble Burgundy," ba-dum, ba-dum. The silence allows for, well, the stage direction that takes place, in essence. Before the King of France, turning to his new wife, says, bid farewell to your sisters." And again the line is shortened, and what happens in that gap? Well, surely what happens in that gap is somehow Cordelia composing herself and thinking about how she is going to phrase her farewell. How does she let her sisters know that she sees them for what they are, but in such a way that is not immediately going to bring even more anger and wrath down upon her as she leaves? There's time there for movement. There's time for thought. Remember, Shakespeare didn't tend to write stage directions. Stage directions are often given to us by the action of the play, but also in this way in verse, because something has to happen to fill those gaps. When the plays are not in verse, they are in prose, prose resembling everyday speech, generally not used of high status or high emotion, and 27% of this play, apparently, is in prose. I have to say I didn't do the maths. Most of the characters speak in prose from time to time. Interestingly, Goneril and Regan tend not to. The only time they do is when they're speaking to each other, and this possibly suggests their rather grandiose ideas of themselves, if you like. But the play opens in prose with Gloucester and Kent, two high-status characters, who therefore one might expect to be speaking in verse, except for the fact they're discussing bastardy and whoring, and generally making jokes about sex, low-status material. It also enables Shakespeare to shift up a gear into verse for the arrival of Lear. The king appears on the stage, and not only does the stage presumably erupt into colour and everything else, but the language being spoken by the characters takes on a more regal tone when that happens. You can chart this sort of way of working throughout the whole play, with the shifts either up or down gear according to what is being discussed. There's a fine moment at the end of Act 1, Scene 1, actually, where Goneril and Regan, left on stage together, come down out of verse in order to urgently start to plan what they might do to restrict Lear, and I talked about that in one of the earlier screencasts as well. So, final notes. Iambic pentameter is generally unrhymed, known as blank verse. When there are rhyming couplets, therefore, we should notice them. They're often used to convey an event of note, often signifying an exit or a close of scene. And here I've gone right to the end of the play. And Edgar's closing words: "The weight of this sad time we must obey. Speak what we feel, not what we ought to say." That sense that the rhyming couplet neatly brings to a close a scene, a discussion, a thought process. Look out for the rhyming couplets. There aren't many, and where they are, they're generally important. Hope this has been helpful. I hope you're going to use some of these ideas as you read the play, and I hope that you will take the time to think carefully about how the verse works on the page. Remember, as a student of A-level, you are expected to understand verse, to comment on structure and form. Don't treat it as an optional extra. It's actually vital to enhancing your understanding of the play as a whole. Thank you for listening.